Today's last panel is on digital media and politics, and it showcases a variety of approaches and questions to this fascinating field. The chair of the panel is very appropriately Shelley Boulianne, one of the experts in this area. She's from MacEwan University in Canada, and Shelley, I'm very happy to hand over to you.
All right, so I just want to remind the presenters that you're allocated to the 25-minute time slot. I will interrupt at 14 minutes to tell you to wrap it up, and I'll just say again that if you keep talking beyond that, you are losing the chance to get feedback from your paper. So we will start with the first presenter, who I see is here. So Kyong Mazzaro. And the paper is Corruption, Incumbency, and the Politics of Online Content Regulation.
Hi, good afternoon. Good morning for me, but good afternoon for you. I'm going to be sharing my screen really quickly. Just bear with me for a second. Perfect. Okay, so let's just jump right in. This is, I'm going to say it like right up front, this is the first draft of the paper. So I'm really in need of a lot of feedback. So I'm very happy to be presenting here today. This paper was born out of, just some policy concerns that I've been seeing in the last few years. So internet freedom monitoring organizations have, raised more and more concerns about the ways in which political elites and also economic elites in democracies worldwide can abuse legislation to restrict or remove political online content. Usually it involves the use of reputation protection, so defamation laws, which may be civil but and also criminal in some contexts. It's most prevalent in electoral contexts. And the interesting thing about this phenomenon is that it's pretty widespread, both in consolidated and non-consolidated democracies alike. In fact, looking at the reports of Freedom House's Freedom on the Net project of 2020, I found that around 80% and 68% of country reports that refer to anocracies and democracies respectively kind of cited or cautioned about the danger of political elites abusing defamation laws or other regulations to restrict political online content. So, although research on the determinants of political online content removal to date is pretty nascent and limited, there are a couple of studies that have looked at the determinants of Google Transparency Project's requests for removal by governments worldwide. There really isn't it's really, I feel that it's really nascent. There isn't a lot of stuff. However, we know from policy accounts and also from research, we know that when political elites abuse legislation to remove content, they do so strategically. And usually it happens in contexts where politicians are attempting to conceal evidence of corruption or malfeasance. And usually their motives are electoral in nature, very strategic in nature. They're attempting to remove content that would hurt the chances that they would either win or stay in office. So this paper really looks at this kind of hypothesis and tries to explore it further. It poses two questions. The main one is, to what extent does corruption really predict the extent to which politicians can abuse the legal system to censor political speech online? And then the second question that it asks is, in contexts where corruption is widespread, what explains variation in patterns of political online content removal? So I have in terms of, why could this be? There is a huge body of research that looks at the role of corruption in shaping patterns of restrictions on media freedom in traditional media, so press, broadcasting, and radio. And they have found that indeed politicians who are corrupt or that are afraid of losing office tend to abuse either regulation or use other strategies to remove content of public interest. There's also evidence so that not only that corruption provides incentives for politicians to remove the content, corruption also provides a means, because in context, it would only be possible to abuse regulation in contexts where, politicians who are in power or who have resources are able to manipulate judicial processes. So corruption on the one hand creates incentives, on the other also creates like the perfect environment for the abuse of regulation. So this leads me to my first hypothesis, which is that, I hypothesize that corruption increases the chances that politicians will abuse regulation to remove political online content. In terms of what explains variation in patterns of removal requests in countries where corruption is widespread, well, I theorize that at the individual level of the politicians, there are two primary drivers. The first one is really intuitive, not surprising, politicians who have open corruption investigations will be more likely to attempt to conceal information than those who do not have those investigations open. And then also being the incumbent, being able to actually abuse office to remove content. And amongst those who are in power, my expectation would be that those who are in the executive office, as opposed to offices where it's harder to abuse office to remove content, will be more likely to be incentivized by incumbency to remove content, and also those who have more money, especially because often the manipulation of judicial processes requires a lot of resources. So to sum it up, I hypothesize that the individual level politicians who are corrupt, as opposed to those who do not have corruption investigations, will be more likely to attempt to remove content. Also, politicians who hold office versus those who are non-incumbents will be more likely. And then in terms of moderators of the effect of incumbency of requests, I hypothesize that on the one hand, being in the executive office versus legislatures or other offices where it's harder to abuse office will increase incumbency's effect of requests, and also being rich will increase incumbency's effect on requests. So my empirical strategy. So here I decided to attempt to explore these questions both cross-nationally and subnationally. So cross-nationally for my first hypothesis on the role of corruption and patterns of abuse, and then subnationally to see at the individual level, what are the determinants of attempts to remove political online content. So let's dive right into the cross-national analysis. For this one, I use data covering the 2000-2018 period for all democracies and anocracies where there is some legal framework that provides some protection against defamatory online content. My dependent variable, very conveniently, is the extent of politicians' abuse of defamation laws to censor political speech online, which is a variable that is available at the Varieties of Democracy dataset. As you can see really quickly, there is substantial variation regionally on the extent of abuse of regulation to censor political online content, with Africa, Asia, and the MENA region on top, and US, Canada, and Western Europe at the bottom, and Eastern Europe, Latin America, right in the middle. As my independent variable, I use corruption, operationalized as to the extent to which political actors use political office for private or political gain. I also use alternative measures of corruption just to test the sensitivity of results and their robustness. And I control also for the extent of legal protections against defamation, political stability, the electoral context, whether there is an election in a year or not, regime type, GDP per capita. I do find that corruption predicts, so for this model, in terms of model specification, I use your standard fixed effect OLS. I also test the robustness of results to alternative specifications. I do find that corruption is a substantive and robust predictor of abuse of regulation to remove political online content. I find that it remains a significant predictor whether we're looking only at democracies or anocracies. I also find, using granular causality tests, that corruption predicts abuse and not the other way around. And I also find that results are not driven by countries in a specific region, even after controlling for electoral systems. When using Google Transparency Project's removal requests instead of VDEM's measure of abuse, and using different measures of corruption. So the result holds. Now let's dive right into the subnational analysis. For this one, I chose a Brazilian case. This is a case, where we know like there's widespread corruption. There is evidence of abuse of regulation to restrict both online and offline political content removal. This practice in the Brazilian case is most prevalent during elections. So for this one, I basically built an individual level cross-sectional data set of Brazilian politicians that ran for office across 3 different elections between 2016 and 2020. This includes 2 local elections, 1 presidential, and around 783,000 politician electoral years, or around 650,000 unique politicians. As my dependent variable, I use data on political online content removal requests by politicians. So this is a count variable, so that looks at the number of requests a politician made in each electoral cycle. And then I use as a main independent variable, one of my independent variables, whether the politician in a specific electoral cycle was the subject of an open corruption investigation that includes malfeasance, and also private processes and processes linked to the politician's professional sphere that are deemed of public interest. I also looked at incumbency, which government branch they are, and their wealth. And I control in all models for wealth, district magnitude, gender, age, whether they're running for the PT, which is a particular party in Brazil that is like really interesting, education, and fixed effects for the electoral cycle. So just doing very basic negative binomial regression with electoral cycle level fixed effects and individual level cluster robust standard errors, I do find that corruption investigation is associated with a higher incidence of political online content removal requests. And I also find that incumbency is associated. So politicians who are in office versus those who are not are more likely to attempt to remove content. There is, however, like in the case of incumbency, there is always this concern, like, can we really compare those who won with those who lost? I mean, the risk of omitted variable bias is always there. So in attempt to ameliorate that, I rerun the model, but this time using a regression discontinuity design, where I compare bare winners to barely losers and see if incumbency still predicts a higher incidence of removal requests. And I do confirm that. And I also find evidence that incumbency has a larger effect for politicians in the executive and for politicians who are in the top 10 percentile of wealth. Just to see it visually, we can see that what we're looking for is a jump in terms of those politicians who are bare losers versus bare winners. And the jump is higher for those who are in the executive versus those who are in the legislature, and also a higher jump for those who are on the left side in the top 10th percentile versus those who are not as rich. In some, cross-national corruption is associated with more abuse of legislation to remove political online content. In the Brazilian context, I find that those who have open corruption investigations and have incumbency advantages are more likely to attempt to remove political online content. And I do find the executive power and wealth amplify the effect of incumbency advantages on politicians' attempts to remove content. And I'm going to wrap up really fast because I'm really interested in that feedback. This is a first attempt, first draft. Among the many limitations that this has, 3 of them is that, I'm not sure about my measure of politicians' abuse of legislation. I think that this field is so nascent that it's like, I feel that conceptually and definitionally, like it's hard to define, this concept of abuse, which can vary so much from one context to another. The Brazilian case is paradigmatic, but it's also very unique compared to other countries. Like Brazilian politicians are professionals in terms of, abusing the legal system to restrict media freedom. Also, I use in the subnational analysis political online content removal requests as my main measure, but that might not be the only way in which politicians abuse regulation to remove content. So I'm wondering what else is out there. And that's it. I think okay, that's it. Let me
That's
stop
14
sharing.
minutes. Yeah, thank you. That's
Okay,
wonderful.
thank you so much.
Perfect timing. All right, so you can hear me. I'm going to read off the first question from Christian Vakari. Thanks for the fascinating presentation. What do you think are the main policy implications of your findings? For instance, should digital platforms develop more robust standards for processing requests from politicians who are in power or who are under investigation for corruption?
Yes, so I think that I feel that in the literature there is a lot of attention in terms of, how private platforms can regulate content themselves, and most of the times the focus is on them, like it's their fault that are not regulating well. But I think that if we take a step back and take into consideration the political context in which this content regulation takes place, we realize that sometimes the abuse of regulation, it's out of the control of private platforms. So it shifts the focus again on government and political processes and corruptions. And so I feel that it would be interesting to also emphasize the role that politicians have in manipulating, regulation that is out of control of the private platforms.
All right, so the next question is from Jason Cyril. So that was an interesting presentation. He's wondering about the evidence of the use of anti-corruption measures themselves from political elites to silence political content. Is this a widespread phenomenon between different countries, or is it particular to specific countries? And if I could just add on a specific question, I know it's discussed in the paper about how there's a low percentage of requests for content removal in Brazil, but can you give us an idea of how many that is? I mean, 0.25% doesn't really give an idea of the numbers that you're working with.
Yes. So first on the one, so anti-corruption. So one of the things that I felt in this paper is that, this is one of my, I'm a PhD student. This is one of my first attempts to do like cross-national research. And the fact that there is so little like qualitative, thick description in terms of, what does it mean to abuse regulation, or how does corruption really position politicians in different countries to abuse? Like, I don't really know. And I would imagine that is very different across contexts. I know that in the case of Brazil, they've used, like anti-corruption measures, and also, concerns about like fake news to try to attempt to, remove. But I know that in other contexts, the narrative is completely different, and the mechanisms through which they remove content is completely different. So I would say I don't know, and I would like to know, and I think that more qualitative research is needed on that front. And then in terms of, how widespread, in the case, the proportion of politicians who make requests for removal in Brazil is really low, because I'm looking at local elections where there are like 100,000 politicians who are making the request. But if we look at the number of requests across the 3 electoral cycles, there were more than 1,000 or 1,500 requests made. So they're pretty massive, like if you think about it. It's just that the proportion is not. But it's a good point. Like, I should talk about that in the paper. Thank you.
Great. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I will follow up with another question about that since we are on the Brazil topic. So in table 3, you had, there's a finding there around the 2018 elections being distinctive. And I was wondering if you could provide a little bit of context on why 2018 was a standout election period.
Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, 2018 was the presidential election. So 2018, so in the case of local elections, I find that the incidence, the number of requests is not as high. When the presidential election came, in which also I believe you elect governors, like the competition is way more fierce, and it kind of like maps out also to the argument that when it comes to politicians who are in executive positions, it's way more intense. Like the competition is way more fierce. So I think that is why in 2018 we see that peak. Eventually, I would like to include more electoral cycles to see if it's really that or something else, or just something unique that happened when Bolsonaro was running.
Are there any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. So again, I don't want to jump in here again if other people have questions, but going back to the first graph, so the cross-national comparisons, that one I'm really interested in. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the statistical controls that you have in there. They're not outlined in the paper, and I just want to make sure I understand that the findings, the key findings on that one. Do you know which table I'm talking about? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm just like pulling that table up. Like it would be like
Table one.
Yes. Let me just go really back. Sorry. Okay, table one. Okay, yes. So one of the controls was the extent of defamation protection. Like I think from a logical standpoint, I would expect that if there are no protections, there's probably no abuse of those protections. So I wanted to measure the extent to which there was actually regulation that allowed politicians to argue, like, reputation or whatever. Then also the extent of online media use. Whether really there is an incentive to remove political online content, because if most of the population does not use online media, it's not even worthwhile to attempt to remove political online content. I also polity score, so the extent to which there is like the democracy is consolidated or not. Although democracy is correlated with corruption, I do feel that theoretically they're two different things. So I added that to take a look at that. And also there is some research that looks at the role of political stability in shaping patterns of online content removal requests from the Google Transparency Project. So just to make sure that that wasn't playing a role as well, I decided to add that variable based on previous research. Also, I added a control of like the regulatory capacity. There might be countries that have amazing protections on paper, but then if they cannot really in practice enforce or regulate, I would expect that the abuse would not be, it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be as widespread. And then in terms of elections, I expected that, since most of the times abuse takes place in electoral context, I imagine that, well, we should take into account whether in a specific year there was an election and whether that election was presidential or not. But yeah, I should explain more of that, more elaborate on the paper. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and Elizabeth has a great open-ended question. She wants to ask if there is something that you specifically want feedback from us.
Yeah, so I was like, I don't really know. I was a little bit, whenever you make an argument saying that something is happening both in democracies and anocracies at the same time, like I always feel that there is this pushback, like, no, it's not the same. So I was wondering, like, I don't really know if I'm onto something. I don't really know. So in terms of the framing, I'm talking about corruption and the fact that it's widespread in both democracies and anocracies at the same time. But I'm not really sure if that is the correct framing. I also went from doing the cross-national analysis and diving into the particular case, but I feel that the data from Brazil are more rich. So I wonder, should I start at the individual level and then do the cross-national stuff as something like I found this in the Brazilian case, maybe looking cross-nationally, this could be generalizable. So I didn't really know what goes first. But overall, I think that my biggest question is does this resonate? Does this make sense? Is there something here, or am I just imagining?
Great. We have a couple of more questions, but I guess I'd like to weigh in on that. I like the cross-national comparison because I do think it sets the stage for discussing Brazil. But if you think that maybe because it is just one table, it might work for more of a research note, and then you can build on it with your more detailed full paper around Brazil, because you are right, you have a lot of data there, and there is an interesting story to be told. Okay, so it looks like we have 3 more questions. So and we don't have a lot of time, so we have 1 minute. Let's see. So can you speak a bit on the distinctions and crossovers between moderation relating to the earlier session and regulation? I'm not sure if you caught the earlier presentation.
No, but I imagine, so So in like, I think that this phenomenon like is particular in the sense that it comes like it is mandated by the state, and it usually involves the removal like from courts, and there is a judicial process behind, which is like harder for individual private platforms to push back or contest. They do it sometimes, but then depending on where they're located, they might face like consequences. So like in that sense, I think that the fact that the state is so involved really changes the dynamic. But I didn't see the previous session, so I'm not really sure. But I'm looking at the other comments, and they're super helpful. Thank you so much for them. I know that we're running out. I'll follow up on the comments later. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And you are exactly right. We are just out of time. So I hope you can respond in the chat to those excellent comments that we didn't get to. So for our next presentation, it's Elizabeth Dubois, Trolling with the Punches, How Journalists Navigate Online Harassment. And just a reminder, I'll interrupt you at 14 minutes. And then from then, wrap it up and save some time for question and answers. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Can you all see me and hear me?
Yes.
Got the screen up?
Perfect.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so I'm Elizabeth Dubois. I'm an associate professor at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Communication. And today I'm presenting alongside Chris Tenove, who is at UBC. We're talking about a project we worked on with former postdoc Sabrina Wilkinson and a current PhD student, Trevor Deley, who's here on the call as well. And we're talking about trolling with the punches, how journalists navigate online harassment. This particular paper is part of a larger project that I've been working on for about 3 years now at my lab, which is the Paul Contact Lab. And so if you want to know more about the larger project, you can head to the website there to find out more info. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who's going to set the scene for us for why exactly we care about how journalists navigate online harassment.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. And I just want to give a quick warning to anyone who's easily startled. My young children are just waking up around now in Vancouver, and I can't keep the door blockaded successfully against them if they charge in. So yeah, our study focuses on the experiences of political journalists covering the 2019 Canadian election. Journalists, as in other countries, are important actors in Canadian elections, mediating and challenging politicians' messages and reflecting or shaping public opinion. In Canada, journalists generally avoid being publicly aligned with particular parties. Nevertheless, for a variety of reasons, their work was fairly politicized in the 2019 election. Journalists were frequently accused of political bias, along with other attacks on them and their work. And so that's what we saw going on in Canada. And it's not surprising. Many of you might know there's a quickly growing body of research on the online abuse of journalists. And much of it is looking at journalists in the United States. And there are a few other country case studies and comparative studies, but nothing in Canada. So that's one of the gaps we wanted to fill with this work. And we also wanted to examine how factors such as gender, race, journalist role, type of organization affect exposure to and experiences of online harassment. A few other studies have looked at some of these relationships, and they've mostly done so by drawing on journalists' self-reported experiences, so using interviews and surveys. For this project, we wanted to develop and test an approach that would use large-scale content moderation to look for patterns of these that we could pick out. And we do that by looking at using computational analysis of mentions of journalists on Twitter, which is by far the most used social media platform by journalists in Canada. So that's the setup. Here are the specific research questions that we're addressing in this paper. The first one is, how do journalists themselves identify and assess the online negativity and harassment they face in the election context? And related to that, do journalists encounter different negativity and harassment due to their perceived gender, race, or their role? Second question, what platform tools do journalists use to manage the negativity and harassment they face? And then a third one, and this is now drawing on the Twitter content analysis, how much negativity was directed at political journalists during the 2019 election? And are there differences in the messages, the negativity messages that they face based on their follower account, perceived gender, perceived race, journalistic role? So those are the questions. One part, a key part of the method was to interview 19 journalists to get a first-person understanding of how it is that they are assessing and responding to negative messages. So we reached out to a diverse set of journalists who varied on some of our key indicators. And you could see here the figures for the number we interviewed of different gender, perceived race, and we also have 4 categories of different levels of follower account. And as part of these interviews, we showed these journalists a set of 5 sample tweets that had different types of negative messaging. And we had them assess and categorize those messages. And then we could use that to identify principles, practices, and ultimately a scale that we found them using when they were assessing messages. So what we propose is a negativity scale as a key axis of interpretation that journalists are employing. And it goes from positive through neutral to three gradations of negativity. So I'll start with the high negativity one. So high negativity messages are threatening or hateful towards the target or the identity group the journalists belong to. Here's an example of one, and I gave a little editing to it, so it would be a PG rating for this the conference. The XXX there, that's replacing the handle of the journalist that was mentioned in the tweet itself. The next one, medium negativity messages are clearly and strongly insulting towards individuals, as you can see in this example. And then low negativity messages are dismissive or more mildly insulting, such as this comment. And just to note that a simple disagreement about facts without this accusation that the journalist doesn't know how to do the work would have counted as a neutral tweet. So we're not pulling out any questions or challenging, civil challenging of a journalist's work as negative. And that's something that the journalist told us. Okay, interviewees we talked to describe many and complex differences in their experiences due to their perceived gender and race. And I just want to quickly highlight 2. First, actually across almost all of the interviewees was a general impression that women and racialized journalists got more frequent negative messaging. So something that we wanted to see, learn more about. And then second, interviewees pointed to some qualitative differences in message content that our negativity scale might not fully capture. And we can talk about some of those, but one is that sort of veiled or implicitly gendered comments directed at women journalists might, it's difficult to say where they fit in our scale sometimes. And then I'll just say, we also talked with our interviewees about how they use Twitter's platform affordances to respond to negative messages. And again, there's complex and kind of nuanced ways they're doing so, which I'm happy to say more about later. But one key takeaway is that when it comes to blocking and reporting, which are 2 of the more extreme or significant actions that you can take using Twitter, journalists frequently did so in response to that high negativity category of tweets, or to accounts that were repeatedly sending high or even medium negativity messages. So our categories that we're using here generally, but not always in every case or precisely, relate to how journalists are addressing comments on Twitter. And I'll just turn it over to Elizabeth now.
Thank you. All right, so I am going to switch gears a little bit and talk about our content analysis for our response to that 3rd research question. Some quick info about how we did this content analysis. We selected 317 different political journalists covering that election. Then we collected, using the Twitter streaming API, all of the mentions of those journalists during the campaign, which led to us having just under 700,000 tweets in our data set. We then manually analyzed just over 3,000 of them in order to create a training data set. And then we trained a machine learning model. And you can see the F-scores here on the side, which basically tell you that our model is not as good as human coders, but it is on par, if not a little better than a lot of the standard ones in the literature right now. And if you guys have questions about that model and stuff, I'm going to save that for the Q&A because Trevor, who's on the call as well, can answer a lot of those questions. All right, so first things first, we wanted to just understand the basic distribution of negativity. And what we saw is when we're looking at how our model categorized tweets, the majority of these mentions of journalists during the campaign were negative to some degree. The most common type of negativity was low negativity. But what we're really interested in this paper is the relationship between that kind of negativity and journalists' characteristics or attributes like gender and role and race and organization. So now I'm going to give you a quick overview of a few of those. You'll have to go to the paper for the others though. So let's first look at follower count. We know that on Twitter, the higher your follower count, the more likely you are to be interacted with. And so it's reasonable to think that that might be related to the amount and type of negativity you get. And what we see highlighted in green on this table is that there's a really clear linear relationship between negativity and follower count. When you have a low follower count, you get less high negativity and you get more positivity. When you have a high follower count, you get more negativity and less positivity. What's really interesting though, and it's what I've highlighted in pink, is that low negativity category. It's pretty high across the board, and there isn't a clear relationship between these two variables. And we also see that if we were to calculate total negativity, which is low, medium, and high added together, basically making this a binary variable rather than a scale, the relationship that I had talked about with that green, it disappears. So what we're seeing here is actually trying to use that scale that Chris talked about might be really important for understanding relationships between people's or journalists' attributes and characteristics and the kind of or intensity or type or amount of negativity they get. Next, we wanted to look at gender and race. And so in this table, what you see is men and racialized folks receive more negativity generally than women or white people. And women and racialized folks receive more positivity than others. What's interesting here is the high and medium negativity are pretty close regardless of the breakdown for these categories. And so it's that low negativity bin that seems most interesting where there's more variation. That's the opposite for follower count. So again, really pointing to how important it is to think of this as a scale rather than just it's negative or it's not. This positivity part too, I'm going to come back to because we're a bit confused by these results and it's not really something we've seen in the literature before. So I wanted to highlight that for you. All right, so ultimately, one of the major highlights we have from this work that we've done is that we need nuanced measures of negativity. So many of the current studies that look at online harassment of various kinds of political figures, including candidates, health officials, and journalists, really look at, is it toxic or is it not? Is it civil or is it uncivil? Is it negative or is it positive? And that just doesn't cut it. We know that because journalists see these things as different and they choose different responses depending on the level of intensity they perceive. We also just saw that in the quantitative results, that depending on the method, you might have a very different view of whether or not those associations exist between sentiment and characteristics of a journalist. And something that we talk about in the paper, but didn't have time for this presentation, is there are differing impacts on journalists, and those differing impacts tend to be perceived by journalists as relative to the identity characteristics of the journalist in question. And so that further suggests that we really need to be thinking of negativity as a multi-class or scale kind of variable. So what I want to leave you with is just a note on our next steps and some questions for you. Obviously, Q&A open to whatever you all want to talk about. We are happy to chat, but there's a couple of things that we are particularly eager to get your opinions on. So first thing is we want to acknowledge that there's some really interesting content within all of those tweets we collected beyond just labeling it in terms of its sentiment intensity. And so our next steps are to dive into that content and really understand the qualities of that negativity. And in particular, as we were doing our manual analysis to create our training data, we noticed these attacks based on bias and credibility in this election context. And we think that's a really fruitful opportunity for future research. On to the questions we've got for you. One, there's that positivity thing that I mentioned. We don't fully understand. We've got some ideas about maybe why women and racialized folks would receive more positivity, even if they are receiving more negativity in the case of racialized individuals or less in the case of women. So that's a confusing result we didn't expect. And we'd love your thoughts or suggestions on what we could look into. Next, I've presented today the quantitative results on follower count, on gender, and on race, but we didn't talk about role, which is in the paper. We also have identified journalistic organization as a key potential variable, but we're interested to know if you all think of other variables that might be useful for us to consider in this kind of research. All right, so I am going to leave it there. I've got a little contact info slide for you if you want to get in touch or in the chat.
Lovely, thank you very much, Elizabeth. We have a few questions in the chat. Let's see. So the amount of negativity is quite staggering. I was wondering if some of it may be explained by people write to journalists, but their negative comments may be directed to the politicians. So do you see that maybe the negativity is directed specifically at the journalist, or are they commenting on politicians? I think I've interpreted that correctly. Christian Vakari, you could jump in if I didn't read your question properly.
I think I get the gist of the question, because it's absolutely something that we saw and that we're looking at. And so very often attacks on journalists, the same tweet will also be a criticism or an attack on a candidate or political party. And I should add, having done a similar study like this on candidates who ran in the same election, we didn't see that as much. The negativity of tweets was usually directed at the candidate themselves. So we're in the process of testing how reliably the model we're using can distinguish between those. We've chosen some features that should be emphasizing the individual that the tweet is directed at, specifically mentioned, and but whether they're able, whether the model can tease apart the attacks on candidates and politicians is something we really do want to quantify, but we can do it and do it in the manually coded tweets.
All right, I have another question from Andy Chadwick. Thanks for the fascinating talk. My question relates to the negativity scale. Some harassment online involves direct threats of the kind that imply some direct behavior to harm the individual. For example, doxing, rape threats, stalking threats. Arguably, these are more emotionally troubling and could therefore produce strong chilling effects. Did these figure in your thinking, and do you think they might vary according to the identity of the journalist?
Yeah, absolutely. Typically, those kinds of attacks got labeled as high negativity because when we talk to the journalists, that's how they interpreted them. They also often, when there's those explicit threats, come with like very intense, strong language that meant that we were coding it as high negativity. And so more or less, when we're trying to understand that, we're looking at the high negativity selection and trying to understand the relationship there. What's interesting is there aren't major differences by gender or race in our data set for high negativity. That said, there are so few of those examples given the size of our data set. And there's also very limited racialized journalists in Canada who covered that election, and slightly more, but still relatively few, particularly prominent women journalists in Canada. And so it means that it's really hard for us to rely on like a statistical analysis beyond just the basic descriptives.
All right, so the next question.
I just want to add one more thing to that. One is that, of course, also a lot of these direct threats aren't on Twitter, or they would be DMs using Twitter. So this is another reason why we are doing interviews, to be able to describe journalists' experiences of that and pick that stuff up. And then one additional issue that came up that we need to kind of think more about, I guess, is whether attacks on, say, women, very prominent women journalists, are intended or received as sending a signal to women journalists that they don't belong in that role. And so I think that's those sort of knock-on effects are also worth considering.
All right, so Holly Smetsko has the next question, and it's more of a comment, but I'm going to add a question to it because I have a question. So echoing Professor Vicari, especially in Canada, where we thought politics was more civil than the US in recent years, especially, but there is a mention in your paper about scaling this up to an international perspective, and I wonder about whether or not we can scale up these interpretations of negativity to a broader level. Like, is it distinctive? What Canadians consider to be negative and harassment and rude, does it differ from the rest of the world?
It's a really excellent question. And, you know, there's two basic ways that you could think of scaling this out and creating international comparison. One is to say we want to have the same categories that mean the same thing every instance of this implementation. Another way is to say, no, what we want to do is understand harassment of journalists in the context in which they are being harassed. In which case, what we want to do is recognize that a scale is a useful measurement tool, but then tune it to the particular cultural context, right? And so it doesn't matter if Canadians have a lower bar for what counts as threatening. The point is that there is a low, there is a medium, and there is a high. And so even if those thresholds or definitions of each category would shift in the US, it's still getting at that nuance. I personally, being somebody who cares a lot about the qualitative and contextual factors, would aim for that approach. That's what I would suggest and lean towards. But I could also see people saying, no, we want to be able to do this cross-nationally. And you could think of things like Amnesty International's approaches where they're trying to actually compare specific types of negativity and toxicity where you would want to go the other way. And it just really requires a cultural understanding.
Great. So there are a lot of posts for additional chat, but I'm going to end with one that ties into the question, Elizabeth, that you asked for feedback on. But Kyong Mazzaro asked, said, great presentation. I'm wondering if it would be worthwhile to collect data on the location and the political orientation of the individual journalists. Also on whether journalists work for local outlets versus national versus international. For instance, in the context of a competitive local election, regional reporters from certain regions might be more likely to be exposed to high negativity. And I guess I'll just add on or tack on a question to that. You did have in the paper some quotes from the CBC. So journalists who are attached to the CBC are public service media. Could you do a comparison to, say, journalists that are not attached to the CBC in terms of looking at the organizational context and how that might differ? And then, of course, regional variations, we have lots of ideas there. I mean, you could look at the Quebec situation, but also I'm actually curious about the Vancouver situation, and there's a lot more diversity in Vancouver and a lot more diversity in journalists, so whether or not there'd be differing effects there. But if you could answer really super fast because we're running out of time. And then of course, for all the other chat comments, I hope you can reply in the chat.
Yeah, we will absolutely hop into the chat and reply to other things. Yeah, so the location, partisan leaning, organization, it's all sort of like a bit of a mishmash, which is one of the reasons why we didn't try and tackle organization in this paper, since it was already quite long. But organization, we are right now thinking about it as definitely CBC versus other, but then also hyper-partisan versus mainstream, or national, regional, local, hyper-local. So we're working through exactly how to do that. I would also add on, in the Canadian context, the French-English divide is also extremely prevalent, and the use of social media is also very distinct between English and French Canada. And so that's another thing that we recognize we need to deal with.
Great, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we run out of time, and I want to stick to time so that we have the last presenter has their full set of feedback, but please do respond on the chat to the great questions. So our last presenter is Laszlo Lorfat, and the presentation is called News We Can Use, Local News and Civic Engagement in Neighborhood Chat Groups Online. So you'll begin, and just a reminder, I'll interrupt you at 14 minutes to tell you to wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, please do that. I hope you can all hear me well. I'm going to, yes. So thanks, my name is Laszlo Horvath, and I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues, most of them in Exeter, or Kyong and in Newcastle. And I'm presenting on citizens' use of what we call neighborhood chat groups. These are groups that can happen on mobile instant messaging platforms, such as a WhatsApp group for a street or a local community or a messenger group. But many of these are not on mobile instant messaging groups. Some of them are on websites. So in case you're wondering what the first logo is on the title side, that's Nextdoor, which is you sign up with your postcode, but it's a website where you can chat about local topics. Or there are, of course, many Facebook-based closed groups. And when I say that I'm presenting preliminary results, I do mean very preliminary. Josh and myself, who are pulling the qualitative and quantitative data together, we both just last month decided to change institutions and cities and moved. So this is going to be really just what we explored a few months ago. So the overview of what is going to happen, we're trying to put together a theoretical framework that connects these neighborhood chat groups with local civic engagement via exposure to local news. So this is going to be a bit more clear when I get to the end of this theoretical framework section. And then I'm going to show you how different kinds of data we have, which is survey work, some URL data, which was voluntarily submitted by the survey panelists, or an ethnography, how these different data collection strategies can talk to this same overarching topic. So in that sense, this is not a traditional, not going to be a traditional paper in which we have a research design and then we are going to collect some data to answer this question, but these are different things we had on the field. And then we're trying to see how these different elements can talk to this common question. So one of the angles where we're getting into the theory is about political talk. So by now, classic works mentioned that interactions in community groups, sport groups, or around the dinner table at home underpin participatory democracy. And by this, they tend to mean that there are positive effects of political talk on political engagement, which can include political participation, but also political knowledge. And there is, of course, evidence that online political talk can lead to these exact same benefits, and these might happen on social networking websites or mobile instant messaging platforms. When it comes to mobile platforms, which is, I think, most of our interest is in these kinds of neighborhood apps, we do have evidence that they can contribute to news exposure, and political conversation does emerge in these groups. And in terms of content, we do know that these groups are a gateway to digital news. There are, however, mixed effects on participation, so the causal link is not at all clear-cut. So this kind of angle and this literature is leaving us with asking, so what about local groups, which are meant to be more about local communities and local empowerment? Is there more of a clear-cut link there? And is that maybe somehow related to local content and local news coverage, which is what I'm going to get to here. When it comes to local media, independently from digital apps and the communication on them, again, now classic works would say that local media appears to function to integrate the community. It is perceived often to engage in different kind of coverage than national media, and this kind of coverage might be less alienating for citizens in their communities. But a big caveat is that today local news look very different from how it looked 30, 40 years ago. They are adapting to digital readership, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. We're going to see examples of both from the ethnography at the end. But these are now digital content providers who are pushing out videos and short stories, very high frequency on social media. So when we look at these developments, then we're asking, so is there maybe more of this local coverage, local news content shared and commented on in these local neighborhood or community groups? And can that maybe serve as a linkage between participating in, engaging in these conversations and local empowerment? But in this preliminary presentation, I'm going to look at these linkages kind of separately. So we haven't pulled the two together yet, but we will be looking at some survey results, which would imply that there is an effect between this group membership and there are, well, not participation, but I definitely explored media attitudes and the local and national trust. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then on the other hand, we also looked at what is going on in the neighborhood groups. So we have a sense of what kind of news is being shared from our panel participants, but we also have some very critical participants in the qualitative study when they are going to talk about local news and especially in these neighborhood groups. So I should also mention that we are pulling together different considerations, and incivility and online harassment is a concern that would turn people away potentially from political participation. We should at some point consider the tone of the coverage, including local coverage, which can again be an alienating factor rather than an engaging factor. We have some means to explore the topics, and we also have different we have a geographical variation in our data, which we also haven't really explored that. And I should also say that the context is this past 18 months, let's say, of COVID, Brexit, Britain. So these will come with its own baggage and context, which might not easily generalize elsewhere. So just going back, I'm going to talk about this. First, the survey work, which is a 3+1 4-wave survey work in England between July 2020 and May 2021. Which has this URL data attachment to it, which I will explain a little bit more. This is not as ambitious as it sounds. It's a little bit more like a smaller scale experimental URL data collection. But we also have across the UK different ethnographical field sites, and one of them in particular, which my colleague Josh covered, had a lot to say about these local chat groups. So I'm going to say some results from that data too. So just very quickly about the survey work, we have these, I'm showing you the respondent numbers. This is with planned attrition, we go down to 2,500 respondents by wave 3, which is where I'm going to present some results from, which I explored now cross-sectionally, but we ask most of the media questions in each wave, so there is an element of longitudinal variation, which we can come back to at a later point. I should also say that these different timings of data collection correspond to different restrictions on mobility and social contact as they were implemented in the UK. And then we have a wave 4 recontact sample and an ethnic minority booster, which is again something we will need to revisit later because we have the same questions and we can tap the same stuff. So I'm just concentrating on the media questions in the survey work. There are some media attitudes which will be more obvious from the regression table. So I'm not going to describe them just yet, but I want to describe you kind of the independent variable, which is membership in neighborhood or community chat groups, which we have this kind of 30% coverage, but we also have a framework of comparison with different kinds of private conversation groups, such as a work chat group, which is 33% we found, and these are, by the way, quite stable across the waves. And then a family of friends chat group, which is up to double, so it's like 61% of people are part of some of those groups. And then we ask them, are you contributing to these groups with some news stories, to which they can answer yes or no. So we have about 26% who contribute news, they say, in these groups. And then lastly, we ask them if they still have some of the URLs that they shared in these groups, would they mind sharing those with us? Or if they don't have that, or they don't want to give us those, then they can just type in the topics if they remember, and up to 5 topics or up to 5 URLs. This way they can share with us. I'm going to mention the numbers here, but I should have written here that this is about 10% of the whole sample shared some URLs with us, which is a little bit less than 300. It's not too much, but it's enough for us to explore a bit. And just very quickly as a headline result, a few months ago when I ran with a little bit of controls, the independent variable is neighborhood chat group, and then the columns are the different dependent variables. So first we have some media attitudes. Does the media providing the info I need? Does it make me seek more news? Is the media largely accurate? Does the media help the country? And then we can see that being part of these neighborhood chat groups, and I should have had the other chat groups here too, does correspond to having more positive media attitudes, but not always, not across all measures, and not necessarily, so doesn't make it very consistent. I do remember that if I put in the non-neighborhood chat groups, I have similar effects. So this kind of media attitudes doesn't seem like it's unique to neighborhood chat groups. What is maybe more unique is the result on national and local trust, which is positive. So I would have expected maybe larger effects on local trust when it comes to being member of neighborhood chat groups, but that's not really the case. It equally impacts both of these types of trusts. Going to the URL data very quickly. So if we have 300 of them, which I could merge with some lookup tables, which classifies the domain, whether that's a local domain. So that's like a fairly standard approach with tracking data. So we can identify whether they shared with us local news domains or national news domains. And in addition to that, which wasn't too much, although it was a sizable proportion, but then we manually went through some of the national ones and realized, because the BBC obviously dominates digital news coverage in the UK, a lot of those are local BBC stations and local BBC coverage. So actually those should be classified as local news. And then what we do find is that there is a very large proportion of local news that is shared in these groups voluntarily, as we've seen submitted by these URLs. I should have mentioned that the previous regression results, I waited for attrition, so that's a weighted, meant to be demographically representative sample. This one with the subsample of the URL submitters, I haven't, so I'm going to have to consider how to do that appropriately. But from what we have, a lot of it is local news. However, these same people, when they are self-reporting, how often do you read local news? It's much less. So it's, I think, quite interesting to see that even though they don't admit to it, there's a lot of local news going on about the pandemic that they themselves share. And then I don't know if I'm being too quick or too slow, but I'm going to give you some headline results about one of the ethnographical field sites, which is, sorry?
You're at 13 minutes right now.
Oh, okay. All right, so this is one of the sites. We otherwise have Newcastle and in the wider area in Sunderland. We also have Devon and coastal Devon and Exeter, part of these. But so when I asked all of our researchers, okay, what do we have about these local groups? It is really in Boston where we had lots of findings. So this is a place which is, I think, known from national media in the UK to have had the highest Brexit vote share in the country. It is also termed as the least integrated town in the country. And by integration here, I mean European Union migrants who live and work in the Boston area. It's a 460% increase in the migrant population. So these are the kinds of issues that this particular location is concerned with. And so when I asked Josh what are the things that are relevant for this paper, he said there are 3 findings that he would mention. Lots of participants have talked about the decline in local print media. I'm going to show some examples in the next slide of what they mean by that. But changes to local print media have undermined trust, it seems, in local political trust. And the second that was mentioned is threat to social cohesion. So disproportionate local news coverage is about European Union migrants. and antisocial behavior. And that's kind of a one-sided coverage. So we must be a bit cautious about what we mean when we see local news circulated in these groups. But then there were some elements of coming together, and there will be at least one participant that he could find who was very positive about neighborhood community groups. There are, for example, volunteer groups. So just very quickly, the decline in local media, people are saying that it's not really local anymore, and that sometimes local journalists would just steal Facebook headlines and they would just report those as local news. When the main threats to social cohesion is this particular Boston Facebook group, which is a closed group, but some of the stuff we can show here, but we have clearance to do so, is about people complaining about antisocial behavior. It's about people complaining about mostly immigrants. And this is all coming from this kind of negativity. So it's a good, well, it doesn't seem like this is the coming together, social cohesion kind of group. But then when it comes to coming together, there are some people, or there's at least one participant who was talking about, well, you can really find your community group. And lots of examples were mentioned about this volunteer group where they could come together despite being new. And this was a diverse nationality, there's a greater diversity group. So these are kind of the considerations we have from the qualitative side. This is leading us to very preliminary conclusions. We have seen already some effects on more positive media attitudes, although these are not necessarily consistent across the different questions. We have some increase in local trust, but also in national trust. So we're not really sure if this is really about local empowerment. We also have large proportion of local content circulated in these groups. But we can also see critical attitudes to the local media. Question is whether that's specific to location and the political climate at the moment, but there were examples of spaces for coming together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. So I don't see any questions in the chat. We are, down to the last 6 minutes for this session, but I guess I will jump in with a question because I'm interested in how you're going to use the longitudinal data. You said you have 4 waves, and I'm just wondering if you could give me some ideas about how you're planning to use that, because I don't believe that the regression model you presented had, yeah, right. Okay, so just give me some ideas about how you plan to use the wonderful data you have.
Right, so ideally we could use longitudinal to strengthen a bit a causal claim about people joining these groups, seeing an increase, but that's a bit of a wishful thinking because I don't remember the exact percentages, but there isn't a whole lot of movement going on when you look at the percentages of who's a member of this. But we can look at the new joiners, we can look at the switchers, maybe someone who has, so that'd be my obvious first guess to check. Another one will be, I think, a variation in the proportion of local coverage as a function. It's not, we can treat waves rather than time purely. It's not just the passage of time, but it also corresponds with different restrictions on social contact. So there will be waves when we have local news from a period of time where people couldn't meet each other. So that'd be quite interesting to see if that has an impact. Whereas we will have waves with relatively free mobility and people could meet. So maybe that's going to come with different kind of coverage. That would be another way to use the longitudinal element.
That would be really interesting to see how changes in social contacting and the lockdowns and whatnot affect engagement in these communities. I wonder though, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you've combined the question about WhatsApp and Facebook together. And I was wondering if you could talk about why you made that choice and what are the implications in terms of understanding platform differences. So for example, on the news sharing side of it, we know that Facebook operates on an algorithm, and so we don't know how that particular post would be factored into the algorithm, whereas WhatsApp is not dependent on the algorithm. So posting a news article will get to the audience.
Right, so just to put it out there, whether or not this was the right question to ask, I don't know, maybe we made a huge mistake, but what we are thinking about is closed groups. We are thinking about this particular mode of communicating with your own community, finding them on a closed group or a private messaging group. So that's the one that unites, and that's what the question is about. To me, it seems whether or not that happens in a WhatsApp group or a Facebook group that has 40 to 50 group members, because these aren't necessarily huge groups. To me, that seemed secondary at the time when we wrote the question. So, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. If it has, huge implications on what they would share, yeah, surely. But I would say that I hope that from the question it was quite clear that we are talking about neighborhood, work, friendship groups, rather than putting something out on your Facebook profile. So it's should be a different kind of news sharing activity. So, and also at the beginning I said that whereas some literature concentrates on mobile instant messaging, some literature would look at social networking sites. This can be either of the two. It is more about the purpose of the group, why it was set up and who's joining with what. So it's about the purpose rather than the mode, in my view.
I don't see any comments on the chat. So
Okay.
I guess I will pursue that a little bit more because I don't know what the experience is around the world, but certainly in Canada, we had a lot of these local groups pop up and they were done through Facebook. I actually don't have my neighbors' contact information to set up a WhatsApp group, but I think it would be much more beneficial. I mean, we had a series of people, or there was an arson in our neighborhood who kept setting fires to various houses and the park and the playground at all various points. And I saw that on Facebook, these messages didn't get responded to right away until people started engaging with that message. No one would see the message, and it's rather urgent. I mean, it's like seconds matter in terms of that kind of content. But again, I know the UK context is different. Everybody's on WhatsApp, but do they have their neighbors, contact information to set up these WhatsApp group? I'm just wondering about the details here.
I can only tell you that in my neighborhood, I can put my phone number on a piece of paper, put it through the mailbox of the person who set up the group, and when we moved in, they said hi to us, and that's how. But again, some of them are sign up. So if you think about Nextdoor, which is very popular in the UK as a website, you kind of have to, of course, know that it exists, because otherwise you would never find out about it. But if you do, then you join yourself. You don't need to wait for anyone's invitation. Just put in your postcode and it gives you a relevant neighborhood.
Are there any questions from the audience? Laszlo, do you have any questions or any requests for feedback on any particular element of your paper?
Just in the meantime, I can see Marina's question. Oh yeah. Do I have questions? Yeah. So there's lots of work to do and lots of exploring to do, and I think that one of the questions that I was really concerned about was what you just asked about the difference between these platforms, and if there is a way to. So I don't know if you think that there are maybe other, I mean, you haven't seen the questionnaire, but it is a fairly standard questionnaire about media consumption. We do have an idea of being on Facebook and WhatsApp and using social media for news, for getting news in general. So these are the standard media questions are all still there. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas how we could use these to a little bit sharpen this, or to get a different, or like a better specified model in which we account for all these to really get at this neighborhood group effect.
Well, I guess the comments were slow in coming, but there are comments now posted to the chat. And so I don't want to go over time, but maybe you can reply on the chat to these last bit of comments, but mostly they're just praise for your presentation. And I will hand it back to Christian Vakari. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.